So now that, at least for most people, the new trial decks are here and the new booster set is out, I think we can all officially say D Format is started for us here in the West. But before we truly get into D Format, I think I'd like to take a few minutes to look back on the format that has just left us, i.e. V Format, because, and maybe I've been realizing this as I've been doing more testing with D, I kind of really love V Format. I know it sounds crazy and still a little early goings, but I think this might have been my favorite Vanguard era all in all. And some of you may be saying, oh, he's just nostalgic and he's old and he doesn't want to accept the new things. I really like Bastion a lot. I really like Hexorb. I've seen Bruce in action, Nirvana. I've seen all the decks, and they're cool. They're fun. There's a lot to already like about D, and that's great. But I don't feel that same level of excitement for new stuff in D that I felt for V. And I'm not trying to put D down, but I'd like to talk about why I think that is, and why I think V will go down as being a really important, interesting, experimental time for Vanguard. Before we get into that, we should probably start at the beginning to give a little context to what the game was like going into the V era. So when Vanguard came out, it was right around the time when Yu-Gi-Oh! Was in a big mess of a format, and a lot of people were kind of looking for a change-up, something new. And Vanguard came along. It was a much simpler game, it was a much more streamlined game. Yeah, you had triggers and everything, but for the most part, this was a much more kind of straightforward, not as complicated new game. And for the first year, it was kind of just that. But then they started doing this thing where with each new season of the anime, and sort of almost like a block, if you will, we would get a new game mechanic. First we got Limit Break, then we got Break Ride, as well as Archetypes. Then we got my personal favorite one, Legion. But then they did something interesting. Going into the new anime and new era for the show, they introduced Strides, the Stride deck, an extra deck for the game, if you will. Actually, that's exactly what it is. There's not really there's no other way to put it. Anyways, so we now had Strides, and for the first year or so of Strides, I really loved it. I loved those first few G sets, because now that there was an extra deck, there was a lot more strategizing in the game. You could guarantee certain cards would show up because, well, you met the requirements to use them. And I liked how those requirements were sort of worked into the game that didn't immediately make one deck so much more superior than the other. And I thought the strides themselves all had interesting, unique effects, and the way they went back at the end of the turn, and the way they used costs, and the way the G-Zone was implemented with the way it worked with the main deck were all very interesting, unique things that separated them from Yu-Gi-Oh! So I was really having a lot of fun. Then, suddenly they started introducing much more broken, overpowered strides. As we continued to move through G era, I felt like every new core set was introducing strides that were just more based around abusing mechanics or going really over the top or like really oppressing your opponent and being really destructive. And the problem with that was, I'm not really against that. Like, the point of the extra deck is to be explosive. The point of the G-Zone. You get my point. But where the problem was coming in was that the main deck wasn't really getting a lot of support. Some did, but for the most part, the main deck was kind of abandoned. You were basically just trying to get to your stride turn, in which case the decks that now had these insane strides would just, like, obliterate you. Or there was the thing that popped up as well, which was people were now implementing older cards into their deck. Things that weren't GB restricted, which allowed them to go off even sooner, so that put some decks in an even more awkward spot, because if you didn't have access to, like, good older cards, my Gold Paladins were a good example of this, because we were locked into Liberators for 2 years, well, a lot of decks were kind of branching out and at least having more functional engines to work with. Golds were kind of behind, and a few other decks were like this too, but I'm a gold player. I relate everything to Gold Paladins. And so just by the end of G era, it felt like the game was a really big, over-the-top mess, and like all the decks were unfair, and it really wasn't fun. Something really did have to be done. And so they elected to wipe the slate clean. G would be its own format, but the main format they would be focusing on would be V. And I remember doing my reaction video to this announcement and not being super excited, interested, but like kind of taking everything with a grain of salt. It felt like a weird idea to reboot everything, bring all the old units back. I don't think gifts were announced right away, but how would this work with units and their old effects and new effects? It seemed like insanity. But then as we started getting stuff, I started noticing things. I started noticing improvements, like grade 1s having bigger shield values. If a unit had no effect, it was because it had another benefit. And then, of course, you had more interesting varieties of effects. A lot of decks now had more streamlined play strategies. And, of course, the elimination of the G-Zone, while it took a certain element of strategy away, did allow for things to maintain a bit more level of control versus where they get. Also, I liked the way the older units were implemented. And of course, then you get the big thing, which is imaginary gifts. Now, with most grade 3s, when you rode them, you got extra things. You could get extra perfect guards, extra zones, to 10k columns. Like, these were really interesting things that really, like, pushed a lot of decks further. Now, if a deck was a protect deck, it's like, it won't have the offense or oppression a lot of times, but damn, having an extra perfect guard for free, that does a lot. Same with Excel clans, and Force clans got a lot of great shit too. This was really interesting, but on top of that, clans, it felt like, had much more better identities to them. Now, because, like, since all the clans were being thought of at once as opposed to being slowly added, I mean, that is, they obviously came in with different booster sets, but it felt like clans could have more defined, like, abilities. Probably the best example would be, like, Tachikaze, another deck I love. They had this new thing called Equip Gauge. I heard this, I'm like, what the fuck? Why are they introducing a new mechanic now? And for only one deck, but it made Tachi so much more interesting and unique and interactive. People oftentimes were like, Shadow Paladin, the clan that sacrifices your allies! Shadows, Tachis, and Great Nature, no one's going to want to hear this, are all basically the same thing. Yes, they may implement one or two things differently, but they ultimately do the same thing. But now, their V support really took them in different directions. They now did a lot of new, unique things. All of these things, I felt like, were huge improvements to the game, and what made it even crazier, it fixed G. I couldn't get over that. I remember the first time I put a premium deck together and played with it at locals. I remember thinking going into it, oh, I'm going to fucking hate this, but no. Because my main deck got such an upgrade, because my grade 1s and 2s could now do so much more early game, it made things a lot more functional. Like, integrating the V stuff and the G stuff led to some really interesting and unique combos. Like, yeah, everyone remembers Gold Paladins as this really, like, abusive clans because you could be at grade 3 while your opponent was at, like, almost grade 0. Or grade 1 at least. But the thing is, lots of decks now had interesting new strategies and capabilities to them. And those were really fun and interesting, and it made the game a lot more fun. Now, it wasn't all perfect. The fact that every starter just did the same thing, even when clans got new starters, wasn't the greatest decision in the world. I felt like it was a little boring at times. And also, I would have liked effect triggers a bit earlier than we're getting them, though at those shield numbers, you wouldn't want to ditch them anyways. But all in all, I think, yeah, V might have been my favorite era as a whole. So moving into D, where, like, shield values went down, and I feel like effects, as of right now, considering it's the first set, aren't as interesting, I do kind of find myself really more interested in looking back to V than looking forward to the future. Now, again, D will probably get some really fun, cool shit, and there is fun, cool shit. I just kind of feel like maybe we had this really, like, great era we might have taken for granted. I didn't even think we needed to ditch V and make, like, a whole nother premium format. I thought we could have just kind of kept going and just added the D stuff. If they're acknowledging V happened in the anime, might as well let us have it here. But yeah, those were my thoughts on V format. Again, Not really trying to talk bad about D or anything else, just in my opinion, V got me excited and interested in Vanguard in a way I don't know if any other sort of set or era of the game succeeded in doing. But that's just my thoughts. In the comment section below, give me your thoughts on V format. Are you more interested in D? Are you less interested? Do you like premium? All that kind of stuff. And as always, click to like, click to subscribe, and join me as we watch D come in and grace us with the D.